solved their quarterback problem, and almost no one noticed when it happened. Not because of a flashy headline, not because of a viral throw, but because it happened quietly, behind closed doors, in meetings, practices, in moments most fans never see. A respected voice close to the organization recently hinted at something that's been building for a while now, and once you hear it, it's hard to unhear. The Browns may not be searching for their future anymore. They may already be watching him take reps right in front of them. For years, Cleveland has lived in quarterback chaos. Promising names came and went, hope arrived loud and left quietly. Every season felt like another reset, another gamble, another explanation about patience and development. Fans learned not to get attached, and insiders learned to not overpromise. But lately, the conversation has changed, not in press releases, not in bold declarations, in tone, in body language, in how coaches speak when they think no one's listening. And the name at the center of it all is Shedeur Sanders. This isn't about hype. In fact, it's the opposite. No victory laps, no loud coronation, just a steady buildup of trust that's starting to outweigh reputation, draft status, and even past investment. While the Browns front office publicly sticks to careful language, the internal evaluation tells a different story. One built on daily consistency, on decision-making under stress, on a quarterback who doesn't need chaos to feel important and doesn't need excuses when things break down. That kind of profile doesn't trend on social media, but it matters deeply inside NFL buildings. What makes this situation even more compelling is how unexpected it feels. Cleveland didn't enter this phase planning a headline-grabbing pivot. They weren't chasing a savior storyline. And yet, as roster decisions loom and every rep is scrutinized, the organization appears to be gravitating towards something they've rarely had before: clarity. Not certainty, but direction. And when a franchise known for indecision starts quietly aligning around one quarterback, that's when people inside the league start paying attention. The most interesting part? This didn't start on game day. It didn't come from one perfect performance or one lucky moment. It started with habits, with how someone prepares, with how teammates respond when the lights aren't on. And now that slow-burning momentum is starting to surface in ways that are impossible to ignore. Because once belief forms inside a locker room, it rarely stays hidden for long. And if you think this story is just about one young quarterback, think again. Because while Cleveland is adjusting its posture, another program tied closely to this journey is already making contingency plans, moves that suggest they see what's coming before the rest of the football world does. The dots are starting to connect, and the picture they're forming raises one unavoidable question. Are we watching the beginning of the Browns' most unexpected quarterback shift yet? Because once you see the signs, you realize this isn't noise, it's a pattern, and what comes next could reshape more than just one depth chart. Something changed inside the Browns facility, and it didn't happen under stadium lights. It didn't come after a splashy stat line or a nationally televised moment. It began in the routine, the parts of football most fans never see. Practice reps that look the same on paper, but feel very different when you're standing on the sideline watching who commands the room and who doesn't. Over the past few weeks, there's been a subtle but unmistakable shift in how the quarterback room operates, and the name popping up more and more in those internal conversations is Shedeur Sanders. Early on, the approach was cautious. That's expected. Cleveland has learned the hard way what happens when optimism gets ahead of evidence. So Sanders was treated like every other young quarterback. Same install pace, same film expectations, same limited margin for error. But something started to separate him from the rest, and it wasn't a single throw or a scripted drill. It was consistency. Day after day, rep after rep, Sanders showed up with the same command, the same calm, the same readiness. Coaches didn't have to reset him after a bad snap, and teammates didn't have to guess where the ball was going to be. That reliability is rare, especially early, and it started to register. Inside NFL buildings, trust forms faster than fans realize. It doesn't come from highlights, it comes from avoiding self-inflicted mistakes, from getting the offense lined up on time, from reading the defense the same way the coordinator sees it on film. Browns staffers began noticing that Sanders wasn't just executing plays, he was running them, making small adjustments at the line, communicating protections clearly, keeping receivers engaged even when a rep went sideways. Those details don't get tweeted, but they matter more than anything else in quarterback evaluations. The locker room felt it too. Veteran players are often the hardest to win over, especially in a franchise that's been through one quarterback reset after another. They don't respond to hype or pedigree. They respond to who helps them do their job on Sundays. And gradually, the body language changed. Receivers started finishing routes harder. Linemen responded to his urgency in the huddle. There was a sense that the offense had a pulse again, even during routine practice sessions. That kind of buy-in doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen by accident. What really caught attention was how little fluctuation there was in Sanders' approach. Young quarterbacks often swing from high to low, one good day, one rough day, then back to square one. With Sanders, the baseline stayed steady. Even on reps that didn't result in completions, the decisions were sound. The ball went where it was supposed to go. The mistakes were correctable, not alarming. For a coaching staff evaluating long-term viability, that distinction is everything. And quietly, without any announcement or depth chart reveal, the conversation inside the building began to change. It wasn't about whether Sanders belonged anymore. It was about how far he could realistically go. Questions shifted from curiosity to projection, from "can he handle this?" to "what happens if we keep building around this?" That's not a small leap, especially for an organization that's been burned by premature confidence before. What made this even more significant is that none of it required selling. Sanders wasn't campaigning, he wasn't forcing moments, he wasn't chasing validation. He just kept stacking days. And in a league where patience is thin and trust is currency, that quiet accumulation started to speak louder than any headline ever could. But practice confidence alone doesn't flip an organization's mindset. There had to be a moment where preparation met pressure. And when that moment came, the reaction inside the Browns building was very different than fans might expect. There's always a point in every quarterback evaluation where theory meets reality. Practice can tell you a lot, but it can't tell you everything. At some point, coaches need to see how a quarterback reacts when the plan breaks, when the pocket shrinks, and when the defense stops playing nice. For Shedeur Sanders, that moment arrived in a game situation that didn't come with much hype on the outside, but carried real weight inside. The matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers wasn't circled by fans as a defining moment. There were no expectations of fireworks, no grand narratives attached to it. But within the Browns' coaching offices, that tape mattered. The Steelers don't simplify things for young quarterbacks. They bring pressure, they disguise coverages, they test poise. And from the opening snaps, it became clear this wasn't going to be a comfortable environment, which is exactly why the evaluation meant more. What stood out immediately wasn't arm talent or creativity, it was restraint. Sanders didn't panic when the pocket collapsed. He didn't drift into trouble. When reads weren't clean, he protected the ball. When the defense showed one look and rotated late, he adjusted without forcing something dangerous. Those decisions don't make highlight reels, but they make coaches sit up in their chairs, because those are the moments where young quarterbacks usually reveal their bad habits. There were plays where the offensive line lost leverage early, plays where pressure arrived before routes fully developed, and instead of trying to be the hero, Sanders did something far more convincing. He took what was there. He reset protections when needed. He stepped into throws instead of fading backward. That kind of discipline under pressure is rare, especially for someone still earning his place. Coaches don't expect perfection in those situations. They look for control, and that's exactly what he showed. Equally important was what didn't happen. No reckless interceptions, no emotional spirals after stalled drives, no visible frustration infecting the huddle. Sanders kept the same tempo whether the offense moved the chains or came up short. That emotional steadiness matters more than fans realize. NFL defenses feast on quarterbacks who unravel. The Steelers didn't get that advantage here, and that registered loud and clear during film review. Inside the Browns organization, the post-game discussion wasn't about box score production. It was about survivability, about whether a quarterback can function when everything around him is unstable, and that's where Sanders gained ground. He didn't just execute the playbook, he managed the situation. He showed that the speed of the game didn't overwhelm him, and that's a threshold many talented quarterbacks never cross. By the time the staff finished reviewing that tape, something subtle but important had changed. Sanders was no longer being evaluated as a developmental option who needed ideal conditions to succeed. He started being viewed as someone who could function in imperfect ones. That distinction carries massive weight at the professional level, especially for a team that knows its offensive line won't always be flawless. That game didn't make headlines, and it didn't crown a starter, but inside the Browns' walls, it forced a recalibration. Coaches walked away knowing one thing for sure. When the game sped up and the pressure turned real, Sanders didn't flinch. And once a quarterback proves he can hold his ground in moments like that, the evaluation stops being theoretical. It becomes personal. Cleveland has been here before. That's the uncomfortable truth hovering over everything happening right now. The Browns have talked themselves into quarterbacks plenty of times, convincing themselves that this one would finally break the cycle. Fans have heard the familiar phrases, upside, potential, tools, development, over and over, only to watch another reset arrive a year or two later. That history is exactly why this moment feels different, and why people inside the building are approaching it with a kind of cautious recognition instead of blind hope.
The biggest difference is how Shedeur Sanders is being evaluated compared to past Browns quarterbacks. This doesn't feel like a projection, it feels like a confirmation. Previous options were often framed as if everything goes right scenarios, if the system fits, if the protection holds, if confidence builds, if mistakes stop. With Sanders, the conversation is flipping. Coaches aren't asking what needs to happen for him to work, they're asking how much more evidence they actually need. That shift shows up in behavior long before it shows up publicly. Teams don't announce belief, they reveal it through actions. More trust with play calls, more responsibility pre-snap, more freedom to make adjustments at the line. Those are privileges quarterbacks earn quietly, and they're rarely given to players the organization still views as experiments. In Cleveland's past, quarterbacks often felt like placeholders while the front office searched for the next answer. With Sanders, the posture is changing. The team isn't just evaluating him, it's starting to operate with him in mind. Another key difference is the absence of urgency-driven optimism. Cleveland has rushed decisions before, reacting to short bursts of success or public pressure. This time, there's restraint. No forced narratives, no crown being handed out early. And yet, underneath that restraint, there's alignment. Coaches, front office voices, and locker room response are pointing in the same direction. That kind of internal consistency hasn't been common for the Browns at quarterback, and it's one of the strongest signals that something real is happening. What also separates this situation is how Sanders fits into the long-term vision. Past quarterbacks often felt like mismatches, players the organization tried to shape into something they weren't. Sanders, by contrast, fits what modern NFL offenses require: quick processing, calm decision-making, command without theatrics. He doesn't need the offense bent entirely around him to function. He elevates it by keeping it on schedule. For a team that has struggled with offensive rhythm more than raw talent, that matters more than arm strength or flash. And then there's the emotional side of it. Cleveland's quarterback history has created scars inside the building. Coaches have been burned, front offices have been embarrassed, jobs have been lost. That leads to hesitation, and understandably so. But even with that context, Sanders is pushing past skepticism through repetition. Not speeches, not moments, reps. Every clean series, every smart check, every calm response under pressure chips away at that institutional doubt. This is why the energy feels different. Not louder, not more dramatic, just steadier. It doesn't feel like the Browns are trying to convince themselves anymore. It feels like they're noticing a reality forming in front of them, one they didn't script but now have to acknowledge. And when a franchise with Cleveland's history starts adjusting its plans instead of selling a vision, that's when you know this conversation has moved beyond hope. It's becoming a decision. When it comes to quarterbacks, Kevin Stefanski is not a man who speaks loosely. Every word is calculated, every pause is intentional. In Cleveland, that matters more than any quote pulled for a headline. Stefanski has lived through the fallout of overpromising before.
He's seen how quickly optimism can turn into regret in this city, so when his tone begins to shift, even slightly, people inside the building notice immediately. Lately, his answers about the quarterback room haven't sounded defensive or dismissive, they've sounded observational, calm, grounded in specifics rather than generalities. Instead of leaning on generic phrases about competition and development, Stefanski has started pointing to traits, consistency, preparation, leadership. Those are not accidental word choices. Coaches at his level don't highlight those qualities publicly unless they're seeing them daily and trusting what they see.
What's just as important is what Stefanski hasn't said. He hasn't rushed to shut down speculation. He hasn't insisted that things are locked in or predetermined. In previous quarterback situations, he was quick to protect the structure, quick to cool expectations. This time, there's space in his responses, room left open. And in NFL circles, silence can be louder than endorsement. When a head coach doesn't close a door, it's usually because he's still walking through it himself. Stefanski's credibility comes from restraint. He doesn't oversell progress because he understands how fragile buy-in can be. That's why his acknowledgement of growth carries so much weight. When he talks about leadership in the locker room and preparation during the week, and certain names consistently come up, it's not coincidence, it's signaling, the kind meant more for the building than the media. Players hear it, assistants hear it, front office personnel definitely hear it. There's also a historical context to how Stefanski operates. He's been burned by quarterbacks who looked ready before they actually were, talented arms that stalled when the pressure mounted, personalities that didn't translate when adversity hit. That experience hardened him, made him slower to trust, slower to praise. So when his language begins to soften, when his evaluations start to feel less guarded, it suggests something more than optimism. It suggests confidence forming carefully, the only way he knows how. Perhaps the most telling sign is how Stefanski frames responsibility. Instead of talking about protecting young quarterbacks from mistakes, he's begun talking about earning opportunities. That subtle distinction matters. Protection implies fragility. Opportunity implies belief, and belief from a head coach whose job depends on winning is never given lightly. It's earned through repetition, composure, and reliability when things aren't going well. Stefanski doesn't need to announce anything. He doesn't need to make bold claims. His words are already doing the work, and for those paying close attention, they're saying more than enough. Because when a coach like him starts leaving room for possibility instead of closing ranks around certainty, it means the evaluation has moved past surface-level curiosity. It means something real is being considered. While the focus in Cleveland has been on what's quietly taking shape inside an NFL locker room, a parallel story has been unfolding in Boulder that adds an entirely new layer to this moment. The moves coming out of Colorado Buffaloes don't look like the decisions of a program patiently waiting on its quarterback. They look like the decisions of a staff preparing for change and doing it with urgency. This isn't a cosmetic rebuild, it's structural. After last season, the message coming out of Colorado was blunt and unfiltered. They got pushed around. The trenches collapsed, and once that happened, nothing else mattered. No scheme could mask it, no playmaker could save it, and Deion Sanders wasn't interested in sugarcoating the reality. Instead of doubling down on flash, the focus shifted hard toward function, strength, depth, experience, the kind of football decisions that don't chase headlines but determine whether a team survives Saturdays. What's striking is the speed of it all. Colorado isn't waiting on slow development curves or 3-year plans. The transfer portal has become mission control. Veteran linemen, plug-and-play contributors, players who don't need time to adjust to physicality. That approach sends a clear message, even if it's never said directly. The program understands the window it's operating in, and it understands that quarterback-driven success doesn't mean much if the foundation underneath it can't hold. This matters because programs don't usually pivot like this unless they're planning ahead, preparing for continuity rather than clinging to the present. Colorado's strategy signals that they're thinking beyond one name, one jersey, one season. It's about building conditions where the next quarterback can function immediately.
And that kind of foresight doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes from awareness, from reading the landscape honestly and accepting that time moves fast in college football. There's also a noticeable change in recruiting language. Less hype, more need-based targeting. Fewer promises about potential, more emphasis on opportunity and immediate impact. That tone shift mirrors what winning programs are doing right now. It reflects an understanding that modern college football isn't about collecting stars, it's about assembling balance before the window closes. All of this feeds back into the larger story. Colorado isn't rebuilding like a team hoping to hold on to its quarterback indefinitely. It's rebuilding like a program that knows success creates turnover, and that planning for life after a star is part of staying relevant. That doesn't diminish what came before, it validates it. Because only programs that have something worth losing feel the need to prepare this deliberately. And when you step back and connect the dots, the timing becomes impossible to ignore. As Cleveland grows more comfortable with what it's seeing, Colorado is quietly reinforcing the ground beneath its future. Two different levels of football, one shared reality, and at the center of both, a quarterback whose trajectory is forcing decisions long before anyone expected them to be made. Because sometimes, the clearest signal that something is coming is how people start preparing for what comes after. There's a reason every serious program and every competitive front office keeps circling back to the same conclusion. The game, at every level, still revolves around one position. You can innovate schemes, rotate talent, and shuffle coordinators, but without the right quarterback, none of it truly matters, and the blueprint for success has never been clearer than it is right now. Look at what's happening with the Ole Miss Rebels. Their rise didn't come from a sudden influx of five-star depth across the board. It came from stability and dominance under center. A quarterback who doesn't just execute plays, but controls tempo, commands trust, and turns efficiency into inevitability. When that's in place, everything else accelerates. Drives stay alive, defenses rest, confidence spreads. The quarterback becomes the system, not just a piece of it. That's the model everyone is chasing, and it's why quarterback evaluation has shifted so dramatically in recent years. Raw talent isn't enough anymore. Arm strength doesn't carry the weight it once did. Decision-making, processing speed, and emotional control now sit at the top of the hierarchy. Coaches want someone who can survive broken plays, disguise recognition, and maintain command when nothing else is clean. Because that's what wins games in environments where mistakes are punished instantly. This blueprint also explains why protection and support have become non-negotiable. Elite quarterback play doesn't come from chaos, it comes from balance. Offensive lines that can create windows instead of miracles. Receivers who understand spacing and timing. Systems built to reduce risk rather than chase spectacle. Programs and teams that understand this aren't just recruiting quarterbacks, they're engineering environments where quarterbacks can elevate everyone else. What makes this model so effective is how it compounds. When a quarterback plays at a high level, recruiting becomes easier. Players want to join stable offenses. Coaches can simplify game plans.
Opponents adjust their entire week around stopping one person. That gravitational pull is the difference between competing and contending. It's why teams with their guy move faster and fail less often than teams still searching. This is where the parallels between college football and the NFL start to blur. The same principles apply. Control over chaos, repetition over improvisation, substance over flash. The teams that get it aren't chasing moments, they're building patterns. And once those patterns take hold, success stops feeling accidental. Both Cleveland and Colorado are responding to this reality in different ways, but with the same understanding. Quarterback play isn't just about filling a spot, it's about setting the direction of an entire organization. Everything flows outward from that decision. Scheme, roster construction, timeline, identity.
And once a team believes it might already have the foundation in place, every move starts to make more sense, because the blueprint doesn't change, only the urgency does. What's quietly winning people over isn't just how Shedeur Sanders throws the football, it's how he carries himself when no one is asking him to perform. In a league obsessed with results, his approach feels almost old school. No rushing the moment, no chasing validation, just a steady commitment to preparation that shows up the same way every single day. Sanders understands something many young quarterbacks struggle with early on. The job isn't about proving you belong, it's about making everyone else's job easier. That mindset shows up in the smallest details: extra time in film sessions, clear communication in the huddle, taking responsibility for protection calls even when things don't go his way. Teammates notice that kind of ownership, and when they do, trust forms quickly. The pressure surrounding Sanders has been unusual from the start. His last name guarantees attention. Comparisons follow him everywhere. Expectations get attached long before he steps onto the field. Lesser players react to that by forcing moments or trying to quiet the noise with big plays. Sanders has gone the other direction. He's refined. Instead of reacting to narratives, he's focused on eliminating weaknesses, reading coverage faster, cleaning up footwork, making sure his answers on the field match what the play design asks for. That discipline has carried over into how he handles adversity. Bad reps don't linger, mistakes don't spiral, coaches don't have to manage his emotions. He processes, corrects, and moves on. That emotional control is one of the hardest traits to evaluate and one of the most valuable. Because when games tighten late, when momentum swings, the quarterback's demeanor often decides how a team responds. What's also resonated inside the building is how little Sanders talks about opportunity. He doesn't frame his journey as something he's owed. There's no entitlement in his approach. He speaks in terms of work, improvement, and execution. That tone matters in professional locker rooms. Veterans aren't interested in potential. They want proof that the person leading them respects the grind as much as they do. Sanders' consistency has created that alignment. There's a confidence to him, but it's measured, not loud, not performative, the kind that comes from knowing the work is there whether anyone acknowledges it or not. That confidence spreads. Receivers begin trusting timing routes. Linemen respond to his urgency. The offense starts to operate with rhythm instead of hesitation. Those shifts don't show up in stat sheets immediately, but they change how a team feels.
That's why the reception around Sanders has evolved so quickly. It's not just coaches evaluating throws, it's players responding to leadership. It's staff noticing reliability. It's an organization seeing a quarterback who treats the position like a responsibility, not a spotlight. And in a league where belief often forms before declarations are made, that approach might be the most convincing argument of all. This isn't a hype cycle. It doesn't feel like one, and more importantly, it isn't being treated like one inside the building. There's no rush to stamp labels or make announcements, but the behaviors are lining up in a way that's hard to ignore. The Cleveland Browns aren't just talking about development anymore, they're adjusting. And teams don't adjust their habits unless belief has already started to take hold. What's unfolding with Shedeur Sanders is quieter than most quarterback storylines, but that's exactly what gives it weight. No viral takeover, no manufactured moments, just consistency stacking on top of consistency until the conversation shifts on its own. The Browns haven't named a future yet, but their actions suggest they're preparing for one. More trust, more responsibility, more alignment across the organization. At the same time, the ripple effects are being felt elsewhere. In Boulder, preparations are underway that suggest foresight rather than uncertainty. Not panic, not denial, but acceptance of how quickly success forces change. Programs that understand the quarterback blueprint don't wait for transitions to become emergencies. They prepare early, quietly, strategically. This moment sits at the intersection of patience and urgency.
Cleveland isn't rushing to crown anyone, but it's also no longer searching blindly. Colorado isn't clinging to the present, but it's not standing still either. Both are responding to the same reality. Quarterback play dictates timelines, and when you believe you have something real, everything else starts moving faster. Sanders isn't campaigning for a role, he's earning it in fragments most fans never see. In preparation habits, in how teammates respond, in the way coaches leave doors open instead of closing them. That's how belief forms at this level, quietly, then suddenly. So, whether the official decision comes sooner or later doesn't change what's already happening. The evaluation has shifted, the tone has changed, and the noise around this story is only going to get louder as more people realize what those inside already know. Because at a certain point, it stops being about potential, and when that happens, the question is no longer if something is real, it's whether anyone is ready to admit it yet.
The strange part isn't that the Cleveland quarterback room is crowded, it's that nothing feels settled, even though the season is technically over. On paper, the Cleveland Browns have names, contracts, and depth charts. In reality, they have uncertainty. One quarterback has a confirmed roster spot, another has the spotlight, another has the money, yet somehow none of them feel safe. Not truly. And that's the tension quietly building in Cleveland right now, a franchise frozen between commitment and collapse. Because when you strip away the press releases and coach speak, what you're left with is a team that doesn't seem to know who it's supposed to be. The front office won't fully back its coach, the coach won't fully commit to a quarterback, and the quarterbacks themselves are playing like every rep could be their last in orange and brown. That's not competition, that's survival. And once that energy creeps in, everything starts to feel temporary. What made this situation impossible to ignore wasn't a win or a loss. It wasn't a quote, it was a moment. Quiet, cold, and unsettling. A final practice under falling snow, cameras locked in. No announcement, no ceremony, just body language, just silence. And somehow it felt louder than any press conference the Browns have held all year, because players don't need to say goodbye when they already know it's coming. At the center of that moment was Shedeur Sanders. No theatrics, no emotion for the cameras, just a quarterback moving with the calm of someone closing a chapter. Every throw looked deliberate, every pause felt intentional. This wasn't a guy fighting for validation, this looked like a guy finishing business, and fans picked up on it immediately because moments like that don't happen by accident. At the same time, the organization around him looked anything but composed. Leadership questions have been stacking up quietly for weeks. Reports claim internal disagreement. Fans sense a reset coming but don't know who's staying for it. Even the most stable figures in the building suddenly feel expendable, especially Kevin Stefanski, a coach who went from safe to questioned faster than anyone expected. In the NFL, that kind of shift doesn't happen unless something deeper is breaking. And then there's the quarterback nobody is openly panicking about, which might be the most dangerous part of all. Dylan Gabriel is staying on the roster. That's confirmed, but staying doesn't mean secure. Staying doesn't mean trusted. Sometimes it just means you're next in line to be tested, or replaced, or pushed into a role nobody wants to fully commit to yet. In Cleveland, even certainty feels conditional. Hovering over everything is the contract that refuses to disappear. Deshaun Watson doesn't need to take a snap for the pressure to follow him. His presence alone shapes every conversation. The investment says franchise leader, the energy says unanswered questions, and when a team can't reconcile those two things, instability becomes the default. So no, this isn't just a quarterback battle. It's an identity crisis happening in real time. Snow on the field, silence from ownership, players playing like they're auditioning for futures that may not involve Cleveland. The Browns aren't rebuilding yet, but they're not standing still either. They're hovering on the edge of a reset they haven't officially acknowledged. And the unsettling part? The moment that confirmed all of this didn't happen on game day. It happened quietly, under falling snow, when one quarterback looked like he already knew how this chapter ends, and the franchise around him still hadn't figured out what comes next.
The snow didn't feel like scenery, it felt like punctuation.
On that final practice day, the kind teams usually treat as routine, the field in Cleveland turned into something heavier. Cold air, muted noise, slow movement. No music blaring, no loose energy. Just snowfall stacking up as if the moment itself was being sealed in real time. And right in the middle of it stood Shedeur Sanders, moving with a focus that didn't match the calendar at all. This wasn't a quarterback gearing up for next week. It looked like someone wrapping things up. Every rep was sharp but restrained. No extra flair, no trying to impress. Just clean drops, deliberate throws, and a calm that felt almost detached. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't forcing anything. It was the kind of body language you see when a player already understands where the line is drawn, even if no one has publicly drawn it yet. What made the moment unsettling wasn't what he did, but what he didn't do. There was no visible frustration, no outward urgency, no energy spent lobbying for attention. Sanders looked comfortable in the quiet, like someone who had already said everything that needed to be said through months of work. The snow kept falling, the reps kept coming, and somehow it all carried this strange sense of finality. Not dramatic, just definitive. The cameras picked up on it almost immediately, not because anything flashy happened, but because nothing did. That footage didn't go viral because it was cinematic, it spread because it felt honest. Fans recognized the posture instantly. This wasn't a mid-season grind, this wasn't preparation for another run. It looked like closure without a press release, a goodbye without words. And when players reach that point, they don't announce it, they let the moment speak. Sanders' movements were controlled, efficient, almost surgical. He wasn't sending a message to coaches or fans. If anything, it looked like he was sending one to himself. Finish strong, leave clean, don't drag it out. That mindset is hard to fake, especially in freezing conditions where emotion tends to spill out naturally. Around him, the environment felt different too. Teammates went through drills, coaches barked instructions, but the usual hum of competition wasn't there. The energy felt contained, cautious, like everyone understood this practice mattered for reasons nobody wanted to say out loud. In a building already dealing with uncertainty, that kind of silence hits harder than chaos. Within hours, clips from that practice were everywhere. Not analyzed for mechanics, not slowed down for footwork breakdowns, but replayed like evidence. Fans weren't asking how he threw, they were asking why it felt like this was the last time they'd see it. And once that question enters the conversation, it doesn't go away. Because in the NFL, endings rarely arrive with announcements. They arrive like this, quietly, in the cold, under falling snow. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. The practice footage alone raised eyebrows, but what really made people uneasy was what came after, or more accurately, what didn't come after. Shedeur Sanders didn't rush to explain anything. No clarifying statement, no emotional media moment, no effort to control the narrative. And for a player who had never shied away from confidence or presence, that sudden restraint felt intentional. Earlier in the season, Sanders' energy was unmistakable. He spoke with edge, backed himself publicly, and carried the kind of swagger that quarterbacks are almost expected to have. But now, that tone was gone. Not replaced with frustration or bitterness, replaced with calm, a quiet, clipped calm that suggested he was done answering the same questions. In every interview, the answers were clean, professional, and strangely closed off. Preparation, team focus, 1 week at a time.
Nothing wrong with the words themselves. It was the absence of everything else that stood out. When reporters pressed about the future, he didn't dodge in the traditional sense. He simply didn't engage. No denial, no confirmation, just redirection. And that kind of silence tends to speak louder than speculation ever could. Players who believe they're staying usually fight for reassurance. Players who are unsure usually leak frustration. Sanders did neither. He looked like someone who had already processed the outcome privately and didn't feel the need to narrate it publicly. Analysts picked up on it quickly. They stopped quoting him and started reading his posture. Shoulders relaxed, eye contact steady, no tension in his delivery. It was the opposite of a quarterback under pressure. It looked like closure.
And that shift set off alarms because it didn't align with the idea that everything was still being evaluated. It looked like evaluation had already happened, just not out loud. Fans felt it too. Social media shifted from debating his performance to dissecting his demeanor. Not, did he play well, but why does he sound done? That's when the narrative changed. The story stopped being about upside or development and started being about timing. End of season timing, exit timing, the kind you recognize only in hindsight until suddenly it's too obvious to ignore. What made the silence heavier was the chaos happening around him. The Browns were anything but quiet. Leaks, reports, vague answers from leadership, the building buzzing with uncertainty. In the middle of all that noise, Sanders' stillness didn't feel accidental. It felt strategic, almost respectful, like he was letting the organization speak for itself. There's a certain confidence required to stay silent when everyone else is guessing your next move. Sanders wasn't trying to win the press conference. He wasn't trying to reassure the fan base. He looked like a quarterback protecting his next chapter rather than explaining his last one. And once that realization settled in, the energy around him changed completely. Because when a player stops talking about the future, it usually means he's already looking at one that doesn't include where he's standing. By the time the Bengals game arrived, the tension was already baked in. This wasn't being framed like a normal divisional matchup. It felt heavier before kickoff, like everyone involved understood this game carried weight that had nothing to do with playoff math. The cold returned, the atmosphere tightened, and once again, the focus drifted toward Shedeur Sanders, not because of hype, but because of what this moment might represent. Facing the Cincinnati Bengals is usually about measuring toughness. This time, it felt like a measuring stick for something else entirely. Final impressions, tape that lingers, moments that get replayed long after the score fades. The kind of game scouts circle quietly, while fans sense without proof that they're watching a closing act rather than a build-up. Sanders played with control, not desperation. The throws were crisp, the pocket movement was composed, but something felt deliberately restrained. There was no forcing the big moment, no reckless push to hijack the spotlight. It looked like a quarterback aware he didn't need fireworks, he needed proof. And proof doesn't always come from highlight plays. Sometimes it comes from calm execution under chaos. What added to the strange energy was the play calling. Conservative, careful, almost hesitant. Reports later suggested the staff was trying to avoid mistakes rather than chase momentum. And it showed. Drives stalled, rhythm never fully locked in. The offense felt functional but disconnected. Like everyone was doing their job without truly committing to the same vision. For fans watching, it was frustrating. For Sanders, it looked like acceptance. This didn't feel like a quarterback being unleashed. It felt like a quarterback being preserved, protected, or maybe quietly phased out while the organization sorted itself behind the scenes. And that uncertainty bled into every snap. Each completion felt less like a building block and more like documentation. One more rep added to the record before the door closed. As the game wore on, the broadcast caught moments that spoke louder than the action. Sanders on the sideline, helmet in hand, eyes forward, expression unreadable. Not upset, not disengaged, just distant. The kind of look players get when their focus has already shifted beyond the immediate result. Fans noticed it instantly. That image spread almost as fast as the snow practice clips. The final whistle came and the score barely mattered. The conversation moved past who won or lost within minutes. This game wasn't remembered for a comeback or collapse. It was remembered for how it felt, like a curtain call that never officially happened, like a player walking off knowing he'd said enough without needing to say goodbye. And as reporters started lining up questions after the game, one thing became clear. Whatever came next for Sanders, this didn't feel like the beginning of it. It felt like the end of something already decided, even if no one was ready to admit it out loud. What made the aftermath even more unsettling was how quiet everything felt at the top. Not chaotic, not defensive, just muted. And that silence followed Kevin Stefanski everywhere.
A coach who once represented steadiness now stood at the center of unanswered questions, and the shift happened so subtly that most people didn't notice until it was already obvious. Not long ago, Stefanski was considered safe, the calm presence, the culture builder, the adult in the room for a franchise that had spent decades chasing stability. He wasn't flashy, but he was trusted. And in this league, trust is currency. But over the course of this season, that currency started losing value. Not because of one bad decision, but because of a slow accumulation of uncertainty. Quarterback rotations that felt reactive, game plans that lacked conviction, messaging that sounded rehearsed instead of resolute. The press conferences became the clearest indicator. Same phrases, same tone, same careful language. We're evaluating everything. We'll look at the tape. We believe in our process. Those phrases are harmless on their own, but when they become the only response, they start to feel like placeholders, not answers. And in the NFL, placeholders are often what you hear right before something changes. What made it louder was ownership's absence from the conversation. No public endorsement, no strong backing, no statement shutting down speculation. In this league, silence from the top office is rarely neutral. It's read as distance. And distance, especially late in a season like this, sends a message without sending a message. Reports began to surface. Nothing explosive, just enough to shift perception. Internal disagreements, according to sources, questions about leadership structure, frustration around quarterback usage and messaging. Nothing officially confirmed, but enough dots that people started connecting them anyway. Analysts stopped debating whether Stefanski would return and started debating timelines instead. Showed. Drives stalled, rhythm never fully locked in. The offense felt functional but disconnected, like everyone was doing their job without truly committing to the same vision. For fans watching, it was frustrating. For Sanders, it looked like acceptance. This didn't feel like a quarterback being unleashed. It felt like a quarterback being preserved, protected, or maybe quietly phased out while the organization sorted itself behind the scenes. And that uncertainty bled into every snap. Each completion felt less like a building block and more like documentation. One more rep added to the record before the door closed. As the game wore on, the broadcast caught moments that spoke louder than the action. Sanders on the sideline, helmet in hand, eyes forward, expression unreadable. Not upset, not disengaged, just distant. The kind of look players get when their focus has already shifted beyond the immediate result. Fans noticed it instantly. That image spread almost as fast as the snow practice clips. The final whistle came and the score barely mattered. The conversation moved past who won or lost within minutes. This game wasn't remembered for a comeback or collapse. It was remembered for how it felt, like a curtain call that never officially happened. Like a player walking off knowing he'd said enough without needing to say goodbye. And as reporters started lining up questions after the game, one thing became clear. Whatever came next for Sanders, this didn't feel like the beginning of it. It felt like the end of something already decided, even if no one was ready to admit it out loud. What made the aftermath even more unsettling was how quiet everything felt at the top. Not chaotic, not defensive, just muted. And that silence followed Kevin Stefanski everywhere. A coach who once represented steadiness now stood at the center of unanswered questions, and the shift happened so subtly that most people didn't notice until it was already obvious. Not long ago, Stefanski was considered safe, the calm presence, the culture builder, the adult in the room for a franchise that had spent decades chasing stability. He wasn't flashy, but he was trusted. And in this league, trust is currency. But over the course of this season, that currency started losing value. Not because of one bad decision, but because of a slow accumulation of uncertainty. Quarterback rotations that felt reactive, game plans that lacked conviction, messaging that sounded rehearsed instead of resolute. The press conferences became the clearest indicator. Same phrases, same tone, same careful language. We're evaluating everything. We'll look at the tape. We believe in our process. Those phrases are harmless on their own, but when they become the only response, they start to feel like placeholders, not answers. And in the NFL, placeholders are often what you hear right before something changes. What made it louder was ownership's absence from the conversation. No public endorsement, no strong backing, no statement shutting down speculation. In this league, silence from the top office is rarely neutral. It's read as distance. And distance, especially late in a season like this, sends a message without sending a message. Reports began to surface. Nothing explosive, just enough to shift perception. Internal disagreements, according to sources, questions about leadership structure, frustration around quarterback usage and messaging. Nothing officially confirmed, but enough dots that people started connecting them anyway. Analysts stopped debating whether Stefanski would return and started debating timelines instead.
The body language didn't help. On the sidelines, he looked composed but detached, calm but hollow. Assistants were animated, players were emotional. Stefanski looked like a man standing slightly outside the moment, managing the optics more than the urgency. Coaches fighting for their jobs usually project intensity. Stefanski projected control, the kind that feels more protective than competitive. Even his defenders grew quieter, not because they suddenly stopped believing in him, but because they recognized the pattern. In this league, once the narrative shifts from performance to future viability, it's almost impossible to reverse. Stefanski wasn't just being judged on wins anymore. He was being evaluated as part of a larger reset question, and that's a dangerous place for any coach to be. By the end of the Bengals game, the contrast was impossible to ignore. A quarterback appearing ready to move on, a franchise signaling change without naming it, and a head coach whose words sounded less like plans and more like reflections. Whatever happens next, this season marked the moment Stefanski stopped feeling like the long-term answer and started feeling like the man standing closest to the exit, waiting for the decision he already sees coming. While the spotlight kept swinging between endings and potential exits, one name sat quietly in the middle of the storm. Dylan Gabriel wasn't trending. He wasn't fueling debate shows. He wasn't framed as the future or the problem. Officially, he had something the others didn't: confirmation, a spot on the roster. But in Cleveland right now, being safe on paper doesn't mean much when everything else is up for review. Gabriel's situation is deceptively uncomfortable. He isn't being chased, he isn't being protected, he's being evaluated, actively, in real time. And that's often the hardest place for a quarterback to exist, because there's no narrative shield. Every snap becomes a test, every throw gets weighed. You're not compared to your own ceiling, you're compared to everyone else's question marks. When he saw the field against the Bengals, it wasn't accidental, it wasn't garbage time either. Those snaps carried intention. The staff was watching mechanics, decision speed, presence, the kind of things that don't pop on a stat sheet, but determine whether a quarterback is viewed as a bridge or a long-term solution. Gabriel didn't light the place up, but he also didn't give anyone a reason to look away. Clean reads, solid footwork, calm pacing. That's what you want from someone under a microscope. But here's the catch. Reliability only matters when chaos is threatening to overwhelm you, and in Cleveland, chaos isn't hypothetical. With Shedeur Sanders seemingly moving on, and Deshaun Watson still hovering over everything, Gabriel isn't being measured in isolation. He's being weighed as an option, a fallback, a potential stabilizer if the reset comes faster than expected. His media approach reflects that reality. Careful, professional, no bravado, no promises, just a repetition of the safest possible phrases. Earn reps, compete every day, focus on what he can control. It's quarterback speak, sure, but it's also survival language. Gabriel knows the league well enough to understand how quickly situations flip. One good stretch can change a career. One misstep can erase a season of work. What makes his position so fragile is that he doesn't control the bigger questions. He doesn't control coaching decisions. He doesn't control ownership's patience. And he definitely doesn't control contracts already signed. All he can do is stay ready, because in a room this unsettled, the next man up often stays up longer than anyone expected.
So while fans argue about bigger names and louder storylines, Gabriel's reality is simpler and harsher. He's not being asked to save the franchise. He's being asked to prove he won't sink it if the Browns are forced to pivot. And in a situation like this, that might be the most dangerous role of all. Even when he wasn't on the field, his presence never left the frame. Deshaun Watson didn't take a snap in the Bengals game, but the camera still found him, headset on, standing near the coaches, tracking every play. And with every shot, the same question lingered in the air, not whispered anymore, just unspoken. Is he still the guy? On paper, the answer should be simple. The contract says franchise cornerstone. The investment says long-term commitment. You don't move on from that easily, especially not in this league. But football decisions aren't made on paper alone. They're made in locker rooms, meeting rooms, and moments like this one, where the gap between expectation and reality becomes impossible to ignore. Watson's season hasn't been disastrous, but it hasn't been commanding either. He hasn't taken ownership of the offense in the way true franchise quarterbacks do. There were flashes, sure, but flashes aren't enough when everything around you is unstable. Leadership has to be unmistakable, and right now, the Browns don't look like a team being led by their highest-paid player. That's where the tension really lives. Reports suggest the front office isn't unified on his future. Some voices believe he deserves a fully healthy season with continuity. Others, according to league chatter, are already quietly exploring alternatives and exit paths. Nothing confirmed, nothing official, just enough smoke to make people uncomfortable. And in a building already full of uncertainty, discomfort spreads fast. The fan base feels it too. Supporters are split. Some still see the upside and argue patience. Others see a massive investment with limited return and wonder how much longer the organization can defend it. Every shot of Watson on the sideline becomes symbolic, not just of where he is, but of where the franchise might be stuck if nothing changes. What makes this situation especially volatile is timing. Younger quarterbacks are pushing, the locker room is watching closely, the coaching staff is under scrutiny. Watson doesn't exist in a vacuum anymore. His performance, presence, and perception now affect decisions far beyond the quarterback room. And if next season doesn't bring clarity, real clarity, this stops being a debate and becomes a reckoning. For now, Watson remains the shadow over everything. Too important to ignore, too expensive to move easily, too uncertain to fully build around with confidence. And until that contradiction is resolved, the Browns' instability doesn't go away, it only waits. Zooming out, the quarterback drama is only the surface layer of something much bigger. What's really happening in Cleveland is an organization stuck in a space it can't afford to occupy. Not fully rebuilding, not truly competing, just floating. The Cleveland Browns look like a franchise caught between two timelines, unsure which one to commit to, and that indecision is bleeding into everything. On the field, the signs are subtle but consistent. Units doing their jobs without synchronicity, drives that start with intent and end without conviction, play calls that feel safe instead of decisive. It's not a lack of effort, it's a lack of alignment. Everyone is moving, but not always in the same direction. That's what a team looks like when priorities aren't shared across the building.
Off the field, the energy feels just as fractured. Messaging from the top is controlled and cautious. Press conferences offer reflection instead of vision. Players speak like professionals, but rarely like believers. There's no rallying cry, no us against the world tone that usually emerges when a team is convinced it's on the right path. Instead, everything feels provisional, temporary, like decisions are being delayed rather than made. Fans sense it too, and not in an emotional way, in an exhausted one. This isn't outrage, it's fatigue. The constant wait-and-see approach has taken its toll. Supporters aren't asking for guarantees anymore, they're asking for clarity. Pick a direction, commit to it, because the middle ground is where franchises lose momentum quietly. This kind of limbo doesn't come from one bad season, it comes from uncertainty stacking up over time. Unclear leadership, shifting quarterback plans, conflicting priorities between winning now and resetting later.
When all of that collides, the result isn't collapse, it's stagnation. And stagnation is harder to fix because it rarely triggers immediate change. Even inside the building, there's a sense that something is coming, but no one is saying what it is yet. Reports of internal evaluations, whispers of structural review, terms like long-term vision being used without explaining what that vision actually is. The Browns aren't just waiting on results, they're waiting on a decision, and the delay is becoming part of the problem. That's what makes this moment so defining. Not the losses, not the stats, but the feeling that the franchise is paused, standing still while everything else moves. And until Cleveland chooses whether this is a reset or a push, every snap, every press conference, every silence will continue to feel exactly the same, unresolved. What if the Cleveland Browns already solved their quarterback problem and almost no one noticed when it happened? Not because of a flashy headline, not because of a